When chaos sweeps across the land, a regular guy taps into his inner beast and becomes a godly mythical werewolf. Now he's on a mission to save his country from total destruction. It's been 100 years since immigrants from the old continent set up a new democratic nation called Patria. But then, they discovered this crazy new energy ore called somnium, and that kicked off a war that split the country in two: the industrial north and the mining heavy south. The South Confederation of Patria had way more people, which gave them the upper hand. Things were looking rough for the North, so they decided to pull out some forbidden technology. Soldiers in white coats got ready for battle, transforming into all sorts of beasts. The battlefields were loud with cannon blasts and gunfire from the southern troops, but the northern beasts weaved through all that chaos like pros. They took down the once impenetrable fortress of the South, but how did this all happen? The northern government had been working on creating these super soldiers to flip the war in their favor. These beastly fighters are called Incarnates, and they can totally change the game on the battlefield with their crazy strength and unique powers. After a big win against the South, the northern soldiers kicked back in their barracks, while Special Sergeant Hank Henriette and his crew got some well-deserved praise. Once they were off duty, Hank and his best buddy Kane went to check in on Dr. Elaine Tenta. Hank asked Elaine how his buddies were doing, but she admitted she didn't catch much from their last fight. Outside the tent, the Incarnates were partying it up, while the others were busy patching themselves up and resting. One of the Incarnates, Will, shared a locket with a picture of his family. He mentioned that his daughter, Schaal, was holding down the fort at their orphanage while he was off fighting in the war. Roy chimed in saying he'd love to meet Schaal because he wanted a wife and kids after all this was over. Hank jumped in, saying Will's daughter sounded pretty awesome. Of course, the talk turned to Hank and his crush on Dr. Elaine, which everyone pretty much knew about. The Incarnates kept dominating battles all over the South Confederation, owning every fight whether it was on land, sea, or in the air. Things were moving fast. One rainy afternoon, both Kane and Hank agreed they'd wrapped this battle up quicker than usual, but then out of nowhere, a soldier let out a panicked scream. Incarnate Abby, who could turn into a three-headed snake, had just taken out 3 soldiers with a single howl. The venomous Hydra Incarnate went wild, attacking anything and everything in sight. The other Incarnates rushed in, trying to snap her out of it, but nothing was working. With Abby on a rampage, the northern soldiers had no choice but to step in. Captain Hank sprinted forward, yelling for everyone to hold their fire. When he finally got close to Abby, he shouted that this wasn't on him. Something was clearly wrong. Abby looked crushed by what was happening, begging Hank to stop him, even though deep down, he knew he wasn't in control. But the other soldiers weren't holding back. They were ready to fire their cannons at Abby, even if it meant taking him out for good. Eventually, they managed to stop Abby, and he transformed back into his human form. It was a jaw-dropping moment, leaving many of them reeling. When Hank called for a medic, hardly anyone moved. They were all in shock from what they just witnessed. Just as Hank reached out, Abby slid his hand into his own venomous mouth and died right there. It was a quick win for the North, but it felt hollow that night. Roy stared at his arm, worrying he might end up like Abby. Kane even asked Elaine if what happened to Abby could happen to him and the other Incarnates, but the grieving doctor had no answers. The next day, the Incarnates built a pyre for Abby's body. Captain Hank urged his downcast comrades to listen up and didn't sugarcoat it. What happened to Abby could easily happen to any one of them. But they weren't just beasts. They were Incarnates with their own wills and pride. So Hank called for an oath. If any of them lost their souls like Abby, they should be the ones to take them out. If something like that happened again, it was their responsibility to stop it. They needed to ensure that their fallen comrades' sacrifices weren't in vain. The Incarnates pushed ahead with their mission, but their numbers kept dwindling with every battle as they geared up to capture the capital. In their final mission, Captain Hank expressed his gratitude to his comrades. Everyone looked defeated. The war had drained them, even though they were coming out on top. Before, their beastly forms were just little patches on their human bodies. The winged Incarnates had normal arms, and the horned ones had lost their horns when they were human. But now, their beastly forms were starting to take over their human sides. The avian Incarnates couldn't get rid of their wings even when they transformed, and the horns of the others had become permanent fixtures. Later that night, Elaine pulled Hank aside for a private chat. She dropped some big news. The war was almost over, and their operation was getting called off. The headquarters had been working on some top-secret ceasefire talks, and a peace treaty draft was already in the works. She revealed that the North and South were about to unite again. Hank was shocked, but relieved that peace was finally on the way. But then Elaine hit him with a bombshell. They wouldn't have a place in that peace. Tearfully, she spun around, aimed her gun at Hank, and pulled the trigger. The bullet hit him, and Hank felt completely paralyzed. It was a brutal, heartbreaking choice, but she believed it had to happen. Elaine explained that the humanity within the Incarnates would eventually fade away, including Hank's. She wanted to stop that from happening, but she couldn't find a cure. If the Incarnates lost their minds, they'd become a much bigger threat to humanity than the war ever was. Since she was the one who created them, she felt it was her responsibility to end things before it got out of hand. Just then, Kane appeared behind them, and Elaine stepped back to talk to him. She apologized for dragging him into this, but as she discussed their plans to eliminate the Incarnates and end their own lives, Kane didn't agree. While Elaine reloaded her gun, Kane aimed his at her, and in a shocking turn of events, Elaine fell right in front of Hank. 2 months later, Hank woke up in a military hospital right by the door. Second Lieutenant Liza Runecastle introduced herself, saying she worked for Patria Union's military intelligence. Now that Hank was awake from his coma, Liza filled him in. The war was long over. That jolted Hank into full awareness, and he demanded to know what had happened to his squad. And what about Elaine? That's why Liza was there. She wanted to know too. The day they found Hank barely alive, Elaine had vanished without a trace. Since then, the Incarnates had disbanded and they'd lost their grip on reality, causing chaos wherever they went. Furious, Hank slammed his fist against the wall, leaving a massive dent. Those who have lost their souls shall be slain by their own. With that oath ringing in his ears, Hank was determined to hunt down his former comrades. Before we dive deeper, let's rewind a bit. Before the call to war, Will Bancroft and his daughter Schaal were busy running their orphanage. One day, they headed to town to restock their food supplies. Unfortunately, prices had shot up because of the ongoing war. While deep in the forest, Schaal spotted a deer within her aim. Will and the kids were waiting eagerly for her to take the shot. But Schaal hesitated, and the deer caught wind of them and bolted away. When they got back to the Bancroft orphanage, a group of soldiers was waiting at the entrance to talk to Will. Their conversation dragged on for a while, and eventually Will made his way into the dining room, where the kids had already finished dinner. Sipping his tea, he dropped the bombshell. He'd been called to war, and he'd be leaving next week. At first, everyone was in shock, but once that wore off, all that was left was Schaal, who was filled with anger and frustration. She slammed her hands on the table, confused about why her dad was going to fight in a war when he wasn't a soldier. Will tried to explain that if he accepted the call, the town and their orphanage would get the funding they needed. The next day, as he got ready to leave, the villagers reassured him they would take good care of his kids. In turn, Will promised he'd do everything he could to end the war. Before he left, Schaal gave her dad a locket with a picture of them and the other kids inside. She put on her bravest face, hoping to see him again soon. Time went by, and eventually, the war ended, and Will came back. But he wasn't the Will everyone knew anymore. Instead of the familiar John William Bancroft, the villagers were greeted by a massive dragon beast. Yet somehow, it was still Will. When he lifted a finger to give Schaal a pat on the shoulder, she recognized him right away. Her heart softened as she welcomed her dad home, and the other kids joined in, making it feel almost like old times. That night, Will was surrounded by his daughter and all the kids. While Schaal was busy calculating their daily expenses, a chilling roar erupted, sending shivers through the whole town. It was her dad's howl, and Shaal's worries kicked into overdrive as she looked into Will's eyes. The villagers gathered at the Bancroft orphanage, complaining that more of their cows had gone missing. They had been suspecting Will for a while since he had been howling every night. One villager suggested that chaining Will up might help prove his innocence. And to make matters worse, they decided to take the children away from the Bancrofts for their safety. It's a heartbreaking situation. Shaal's dad left as a good man, but returned as a monster. Everyone recognizes him as Will, but it's like he's never stopped being that monster in their eyes. Life has always been tough, but at least Schaal had her father and the kids to lean on. Now that he's gone, she feels completely alone on this thorny path. That evening, the rain comes pouring down. Suddenly, there's an explosion deep in the forest, catching Schaal off guard and making her worry. She rushes out to check it out and is met with the tragic sight of her fallen father at the mercy of a man in a white uniform. "Schaal!" he calls weakly, but it's too late. He can only give her one last look as he falls, powerless against his attacker. No matter how much Schaal cries and begs that night, time keeps marching on, eventually leading her to her father's grave. Standing in front of the tombstone, she reflects on their last moments together. Her grief hardens into a cold rage as she remembers the man in white. She's filled with questions and a burning desire for revenge. Armed only with her rifle and an iron will, Schaal leaves the orphanage, determined to hunt down her father's killer. She travels to different towns, searching for any leads on the man in the white coat. Just when she's about to lose hope, she spots him in a tavern. Without thinking twice, she grabs her rifle and takes a shot. The bullet hits him square in the chest, but the guy acts like nothing happened. Then he charges at Schaal, scooping her up and carrying her into a nearby alley. He demands to know who she is, and Schaal quickly responds, "I'm Will's daughter." Just then, they hear the townsfolk buzzing about someone named Danny who's back in town. Standing before them is a massive guy named Danny, grinning as he addresses everyone, especially his mom. Everyone seems a bit wary of him, but he's oblivious. He excitedly shows off a bloodied bag full of jewelry and coins, claiming that if they sell this stuff, the town will really thrive. Their chatter is cut short when the man starts to approach, bringing news about several wagons that have been attacked on the road. He pulls off his hood and it's none other than Captain Hank. Danny's eyes widen in shock when he sees him. Hank reminds him of the oath they took that day. "Those who have lost their souls shall be slain by their own." But Danny starts to lose it, asking for their stuff nicely. As he begins to transform, rage takes over his already shattered mind. He declares he'll destroy everyone in his path, including his own captain. The clash between the two Incarnates is intense. Danny may be a juggernaut, but Hank's experience shines through as he quickly overpowers his comrade with a special bullet from his pistol. It's painful for Hank to aim at Danny, a fellow soldier he led through the horrors of war. Memories flood back of the kind-hearted boy Danny once was. Back in the day, Danny's bright smile lit up their poor town, where even a cup of coffee was a luxury. Just like Will Bancroft, Danny joined the fight for a better future for everyone. With tears streaming down his face, Danny weakly asks Hank if it would have been better if they had died as gods on the battlefield. Hank feels a deep ache in his chest at this question. The thought of taking another comrade's life weighs heavily on him, but he steels himself. "I'm sorry," he murmurs before pulling the trigger. Danny's mother rushes to her fallen son, her cries echoing in Hank's ears as he walks away, only to be stopped by Schaal, who holds him at gunpoint. "Are you just going to keep hunting down your own men?" she demands, fury radiating from her. Hank replies that it's because of the oath they took. "But the war is over," Schaal retorts, her voice filled with anguish. "It's not over," Hank insists. "None of it is. We never finished it." His words leave Schaal with even more questions, and she screams that he killed her father before she could learn the truth about the Incarnates. Schaal bombards Hank with questions, but he remains silent. She won't back down, determined to know the truth. "If you won't tell me, then I'm coming with you," she declares, resolved to see for herself why her father had to die. For many, the war might be over, but for those who lived through it, it's an inescapable part of them that they drag back home. While war never changes, the people who endure it certainly do. Both Schaal and Hank understand this all too well. They stand at opposite ends of the spectrum. Hank knows why they must be eliminated, while Schaal struggles to comprehend the necessity. Despite their differences, they're both victims of the tragic cycle of conflict. The road ahead will be painful and bloody, but perhaps it's a journey they can navigate together. And that's a wrap on this anime. But don't worry, there's plenty more excitement coming your way. If you want to stay updated on all the latest anime recaps, hit that subscribe button now. You'll always be the first to catch our latest breakdowns.